The midday sun poured through the large windows of Sierra Grill, casting a warm golden glow across the humble but bustling restaurant. Tucked away in Carmel by the Sea, California, Sierra Grill wasn't a luxurious or high-end establishment, but it had its charm, a place that combined rustic coziness with just enough modern flair to make it inviting. The wood-paneled walls, mismatched tables, and soft hum of conversation created a welcoming atmosphere that seemed to draw in locals looking for a hearty meal on a pleasant Thursday afternoon. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect celebrities to dine or for famous faces to walk through the door. No, this was the kind of spot where the regulars felt at home and newcomers quickly became regulars. But for Megan, a 23-year-old waitress who had just moved to Carmel to escape the small-town monotony of her childhood, charm wasn't nearly enough to make up for the stress of her job. In fact, the charm of Sierra Grill only seemed to amplify her frustration. Her shift had been a chaotic blur ever since she clocked in at noon. The moment she set foot on the restaurant floor, it was as if the universe had conspired to throw every possible curveball her way. She darted from table to table, her ponytail bouncing behind her as she navigated the narrow aisles between booths and chairs, holding a tray that seemed perpetually full of drinks that never quite made it to their destination without someone complaining about something. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," a fellow server called to her, his voice strained as he tried to keep up with the frenzied pace of orders. Megan didn't even glance up as she jotted down the latest order in her notepad, her pen flying across the paper with a practiced speed that had long since become second nature. Her eyes were fixed on the mess in front of her. Half-empty drink glasses, stray napkins, and the scattered remnants of meals that had clearly been enjoyed just moments before. It felt like the universe was holding her hostage in a constant loop of complaints, misunderstandings, and irritable customers. Just in the past hour, she'd dealt with 3 different customers who had all found some reason to leave her with little more than a few crumpled bills and a side of harsh words. Each of them had come with some form of criticism, whether it was the temperature of their steak, the wrong side dish, or the simple fact that the food had arrived 5 minutes later than they expected. It didn't matter how hard she tried to keep up. No matter what she did, it was never good enough. "One more customer," Megan muttered to herself as she wiped down the counter near the kitchen, eyeing the door as yet another person walked in. Her hand was still wrapped around a glass of water she had yet to deliver to a table. The door swung open, and an elderly man in his 80s strolled in, moving slowly, but with a quiet kind of grace. He made his way to a corner table and quietly took a seat, settling himself down with a slight sigh. Megan gave him a once-over, taking note of his unkempt appearance. His flannel shirt, which had clearly seen better days, was tucked into a pair of faded jeans. A well-worn Stetson hat rested on the table beside him, as though it had been placed there without a care. His boots looked like they had walked thousands of miles of dirt roads, and the man himself exuded an air of simplicity, like he hadn't spent a second worrying about appearances in years. Megan couldn't help but smirk as she looked him over, her lips curling slightly as she muttered under her breath, "Great. Another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1." It wasn't that Megan was necessarily averse to working hard. She was a hard worker, perhaps too hard at times. But it had been one of those days, a long, drawn-out battle against customers who seemed to expect the world from her while offering nothing in return. The tips were sparse, the complaints were endless, and all she wanted was to make it through the rest of her shift with a shred of sanity intact. But duty called. She couldn't avoid him forever. Her coworker, a young guy named Sam with a perpetual grin plastered across his face, nudged her gently as he walked by, his voice a whisper. "You've got table 12. Megan sighed, rolling her eyes slightly. "Thanks, Sam," she muttered, grabbing her notepad and giving herself a mental pep talk. Just another table, just another order. She pasted a smile on her face, the kind she had perfected over the years, and made her way toward the corner table where the elderly man sat. Her movements were quick and practiced, though there was an edge of impatience in her demeanor. After all, she had no idea what kind of customer she was about to deal with. And right now, the thought of another difficult person was the last thing she needed. As she approached, the man looked up at her. His eyes were sharp, a piercing gray-blue that seemed to take her in all at once. For a moment, Megan felt the weight of his gaze, a strange feeling that made her pause just a little longer than usual. There was something about him, a quiet intensity in the way he looked at her, but she couldn't quite place it. Maybe he was just one of those people who had an air of authority, someone who had lived through decades of life and had the experience to back it up. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone polite, though tinged with the faintest hint of annoyance. She wasn't sure why she was even asking. It felt like this man was the kind who'd order the cheapest thing on the menu and offer no more than a grunt in response. "Just a burger," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. There was a weight to it, a kind of gravelly authority that she couldn't help but notice. It wasn't the voice of just any old man. It was the voice of someone who had lived a life and had seen more than most people would ever understand. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" she asked, her pen tapping against the notepad absent-mindedly. It was the routine question, the polite follow-up, the thing she said to every customer no matter how little they wanted to interact with her. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly as he did so, his eyes never leaving hers. Megan, of course, wasn't in the mood for any formalities. The "ma'am" was a little too much for her at this point, especially given how tired she felt. She couldn't help but roll her eyes as she turned away. "Ma'am, really?" she muttered under her breath as she walked toward the kitchen. It was the kind of thing that always rubbed her the wrong way, when people assumed they could be all formal and respectful, without ever realizing that it didn't change the fact that they were still one of many customers she had to deal with in a single shift. But something about the man's presence lingered in her mind. Even as she hurried to place the order with the kitchen staff, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. He wasn't like the other customers she had dealt with that day. Rude, demanding, or dismissive. No, this man carried himself differently. There was a quiet kind of confidence about him, something that made it feel like he was simply watching and waiting for something. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was nothing at all. But as she placed the order and returned to her duties, Megan had no idea just how wrong she was. The man at table 12 was no ordinary customer, and she was about to learn that the hard way. Megan returned to table 12 with the man's burger after a few minutes. The plate clattered onto the table, the sound sharp in the otherwise peaceful moment. It wasn't a clattering of frustration or anger, but more a reflection of her exhaustion. She had no energy left to care about her usual level of service. Her smile, too, felt strained, more of a reflex than anything genuine. It was as if the weight of the entire day had culminated in this one small interaction. The man at the table didn't seem to notice her distracted attitude, or if he did, he didn't show it. He remained still, his eyes focused on the plate in front of him. "Here you go," Megan said, brushing a stray lock of hair out of her face, as she placed the ketchup bottle next to his plate. It wasn't done with the usual careful placement, but more out of habit than anything else. The effort of being her best self had long since drained from her. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone more mechanical than she intended. She tried to muster the same level of energy she usually reserved for more engaging customers, but the words came out flat. The man glanced briefly at the burger, inspecting it with the kind of gaze you'd expect from someone used to taking their time. Then, just as slowly, his eyes returned to hers. "No, this looks just fine, thank you." His words were polite, almost too polite, but there was something else in his voice, a firmness, a quiet confidence that made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. It wasn't just the politeness, but the weight behind it. It was carrying some unspoken meaning. The simple thank you wasn't just about gratitude. It felt measured, thoughtful, like the man was considering every word he spoke with precision. Megan hesitated, standing awkwardly in front of him, still holding the tray in her hand as if waiting for something to happen. She didn't know why she lingered. Most customers would have already been halfway through their meal by now, with her moving on to the next table, checking on them, making sure they had everything they needed. But for some reason, she stayed. Maybe it was the calmness in his demeanor, the stillness. Maybe it was the fact that everyone else in the restaurant, customers and staff alike, was either complaining about something, snapping their fingers for attention, or rushing around in a whirlwind of chaos. And then there was this man, sitting there so quietly, so composed, as if the madness around him didn't touch him at all. It irritated her in ways she couldn't quite explain. He wasn't the typical customer, the kind who would snap at her for a mistake or make her feel like she was under a microscope. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked abruptly, leaning slightly against the edge of the table, her arms crossed. It wasn't the most professional way to approach the situation, but Megan was past caring. She had worked enough shifts, dealt with enough people, and held back enough snarky comments. Today, she wasn't in the mood for restraint. She'd been polite for hours, dealing with customers who seemed to think they were entitled to the world. And now, here was this man, so calm, so collected, and it was making her feel oddly tense. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger in half with deliberate precision, as though he were making an art out of the simplest of actions. "Thought so," Megan said, smirking again. "The hat gave it away. Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time since he'd sat down, the man's face twitched, a small smile. Not wide, not boisterous, but enough to be noticeable. His lips curled just slightly at the corners. "Something like that," he said, his voice still calm and steady. Megan expected him to bristle, to get defensive, or maybe crack a sarcastic remark. In return, she expected him to be like everyone else, impatient or annoyed at her forwardness. But he didn't. He simply accepted it, almost like he'd been expecting something like that. His reaction, or lack of it, only served to frustrate her further. She wanted him to snap. She wanted him to throw out a comment that she could shoot back at him. Maybe a little sarcastic, maybe a little biting. But no, this man was different. The calmness, the ease in which he carried himself, it was all maddening. She said, lowering her voice slightly, as if about to share some insider knowledge. "Most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." She watched him as he took another measured bite of his burger, his eyes scanning the restaurant again, as though he were taking the whole place in. He didn't respond immediately, and Megan felt her irritation bubbling up again. Maybe he didn't even hear her, but after a beat, he set the burger down and looked back at her. "I guess I'm not most people, Tiaras," he said, his tone unchanging. His words were simple, nothing extraordinary, but they carried an unexpected weight that Megan wasn't prepared for. There was something in the way he said it. He wasn't just talking about being a tourist in a small town. It was more than that. The phrase lingered in the air, settling between them like an unspoken truth. Megan's gut twisted uncomfortably as she felt a sudden flicker of embarrassment rise inside her. She quickly buried it, forcing herself to push past the unease. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, the words coming out more clipped than she intended. She quickly pushed herself off the table, eager to move on, eager to escape the quiet tension that had built up. She was sure she'd gotten the last word, and that was what mattered. But as she walked away, clearing the nearby table, her eyes flicked back toward him. She couldn't help it. Something in her was drawn to the man, almost as if there was something about him that deserved more attention than she had given. His eyes were fixed on her as she cleared the table, but not in the way most customers would watch a server. There was no impatience, no desire for more attention. No, it was different. It was as if he was watching her in a way that made her feel like she was being evaluated, judged, even. Megan wasn't used to being under the scrutiny of a stranger in such a calm, yet penetrating way. It was unsettling. She couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much, but it did. As she moved to another table, her thoughts kept returning to that look. The way he had looked at her, like he was seeing through all the usual layers of small talk and polite gestures. For some reason, it made her feel vulnerable. And for some reason, that vulnerability gnawed at her. The rest of the lunch rush passed by without incident. But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The day seemed to stretch on forever. But as she glanced over at table 12 once more, the man was finishing his meal at his own steady pace. He wasn't in any hurry. He sipped his water slowly, his gaze drifting around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. She couldn't tell if he was simply enjoying his meal or if he was observing everything around him. But whatever it was, he had a way of making her feel like the center of his attention, even though she was nowhere near him. The curiosity was there, hidden behind the calm demeanor. But there was something else, too, a feeling Megan couldn't quite identify, but one that made her feel like her day had just taken an unexpected turn. "Hey, Megan," her co-worker Danny said as he passed her on his way to the back. He paused for a moment, glancing over at table 12 where the man sat, still leisurely finishing his meal. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? He's just taking it all in." Megan didn't even look up, continuing to wipe down the counter with more force than necessary. "Well, some people have all the time in the world," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't her most enthusiastic response, but she wasn't in the mood for a drawn-out conversation. Not today. Danny chuckled, clearly amused. "Maybe he's famous or something, and he looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. But that small flicker of curiosity rose up again. Famous? It wasn't the first time a customer had been given the famous label. But it was different this time. She had thought the man's face seemed vaguely familiar, but she had written it off. His appearance, with the worn hat, the weathered clothes, and that quiet, composed air, screamed of someone who had spent more time outdoors than in the spotlight. "Famous? Right," she replied sarcastically, shaking her head. "If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow, but wisely didn't press further. Megan was done with all the speculation. She was tired, and the last thing she wanted was to entertain the idea that some random customer might be someone important. She had enough to think about without wondering if she was serving the next big celebrity. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and walked over, determined to make this interaction as quick as possible. Her shift was almost over, and she could already taste the sweet relief of being off the clock. But, like it always, seemed to happen on days when she was least prepared for it. Something was about to shift. "Here's your check," Megan said, placing it on the table with a strained smile that she hoped was more polite than tired. She had already been working for hours, but she needed to wrap things up. "Whenever you're ready." The man didn't immediately reach for the check. He simply stared at it for a moment, as if considering the best time to take it. But his gaze didn't stay on the paper for long. Instead, it rose, locking eyes with Megan. She felt the air around her tighten. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice low, calm, deliberate. Megan froze. The question caught her off guard. She blinked twice, unsure how to respond, her practiced smile faltering slightly. She wasn't used to customers asking questions like this, especially not from people who seemed to have little interest in anything beyond their meal. Most customers were only concerned with whether their food was hot enough or if they'd gotten the right drink. To be honest, this question felt like a curveball, and Megan wasn't quite sure how to handle it. "It's fine," she said with a shrug, her voice faltering slightly. She immediately regretted it. Of course, it was more than just fine, but she wasn't about to pour her heart out to a man she'd never met before, who probably didn't care about her struggles or her exhaustion. "It's a job, you know," she added quickly, hoping that would be the end of it. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. It wasn't sympathy, nor was it indifference. It was just an acknowledgement of what she had said. He understood more than he was letting on. "A job's what you make of it," he said after a beat, his voice still calm and steady. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt a hot flush creep up her neck. Who was he to comment on her attitude? Who was he to suggest that she was carrying a lot? He didn't know anything about her day, about the frustration she'd felt from rude customers, about the exhaustion from her non-stop pace. How dare he assume? She crossed her arms, defensive. "Look," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he sat back in his chair with a faint smile, tugging at the corners of his lips. His hands still resting on the table, his posture relaxed. It wasn't a mocking smile, nor was it one of pity. It was just understanding. It was the kind of smile someone might give if they had seen more than their fair share of rough days, if they had lived through their own set of struggles. But he didn't press further. He simply waited, as if giving her the space to speak her mind. "Fair enough," he said after a moment. His voice was almost gentle, too gentle for a confrontation. "But sometimes how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." Megan's eyes widened slightly, the words landing harder than she expected. The flicker of anger that had been simmering inside her began to rise. Was he lecturing her? Was he really trying to tell her how to do her job, how to live her life? Before she could open her mouth to retort, he stood up, pushing his chair back quietly. The movement was calm, deliberate, and it left no room for Megan to say anything in response. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wallet. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. There was no dramatic flourish, no extra fanfare, just a simple, quiet gesture that spoke volumes. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else, "Whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something strange happened. Her manager, Carol, suddenly appeared from the back office. Her eyes lit up when she spotted the man heading for the door, and she hurried toward him, her smile widening. "Mr. Eastwood," Carol exclaimed with a mix of surprise and excitement. "I wasn't expecting you today." Megan froze. Her stomach seemed to drop into her feet as the words registered. "Mr. Eastwood." The name reverberated in her mind, and for the first time she felt her entire body go cold. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. Her eyes widened as she watched the man turn back, acknowledging Carol with a calm nod, his hand extended in greeting. He shook her hand briefly, his face maintaining that same calm, almost enigmatic expression. And in that moment, Megan realized she hadn't just insulted an unassuming customer. She had just insulted the owner of the restaurant. Her heart raced, and she felt a heat rise in her face as embarrassment flooded over her. All those sarcastic comments, the dismissive tone, the assumptions, all of it, aimed at Clint Eastwood. Of all people, the man who owned the place, the man who was quietly sitting there, taking it all in, completely unaware of the storm he had just unwittingly caused in her world. Megan stood there for a moment, frozen in place, as everything she had thought she knew about the situation came crashing down. It wasn't just a rude customer she had misjudged. It was the Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and owner of the very restaurant where she worked. Her stomach churned. What had she just done?